Okay.
Good. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming this morning. You all know who I am. I'm Alison Steele. I'm going to talk about myself just a tiny little bit as we go through this presentation. Please do not be intimidated by all of these toys here. I do technical training for a living, and I own my own business, so this is standard operating procedure for me. And I suppose there's other ways I could have designed this presentation, but this is just natural for me, so I have an overwhelming amount of toys. Sandra said in her presentation, she made an observation that was very relevant. She said that she's a very visual learner. Well, the fact is we all are. There's something like 60% of our brains are devoted to visual processing. And so that's another reason why I tend to use good old standard PowerPoint, is because there's images. I want a lot of images I actually want to include here. And so that makes it easier for the brain to remember. I tend not to be a very handout-driven person, because I find they end up on the shelf and nobody, whether it's technical training or any other kind of teaching, nobody looks at them again, ever, really. Whereas I would much prefer that you retain some kind of a visual impression into the future. I think it'll serve you much better. So those are the reasons why I've chosen this format this morning. It's familiar to me, and it also helps. I also like the big screen because the Dharma is larger than all of us. So I like this imposing view. We are going to be, I think everybody has the hard copy version of this book. There's various editions, including an ebook. But this is the one, when I'm referring to page numbers in here, it's going to be in this version. Pretty much everyone is familiar with its author by this time, Thich, Hanh, Vietnamese Buddhist monk. They're, world-renowned for the strides that he has made in promoting Buddhism and the Dharma in the West. He actually does combine very many different types of influences into his style, although he has a kind of a style all its own, and I'll get to that in a minute. What falls out of that amalgamation is definitely distinct. Now, regarding these two presentations, has anyone ever seen this website? This is a fascinating website. It's the Photodharma website. And this guy, I believe he's a monastic or a visiting monastic somewhere in Asia. He's posted up 5,000 different pictures of temples and scenes and all this kind of stuff from all across the Asian depth and breadth of Buddhist expression, and it's all open. He hasn't copyrighted any of it, so it's just fascinating to see what he's done, and he's made it available to everyone, and we don't have to run into copyright issues. However, the way I've structured this is, of course, this is very bad PowerPoint form. I am going to distribute a PDF of this. There are many words on it, so that if anyone wants to review it who hasn't been here, you can actually follow it by reading the many words, but you may want to more listen in the presentation and go through all that. I am going to be intentionally diverting from the book here and there. I'll get to that in a minute. And this particular picture may be not subject to copyright restrictions, but there is material here that I'm not so sure about, so if you decide that you want to forward this to your friends or whatever, I don't know what the ramifications of that. I just made the presentation, and I'm just going to give it, and then I'm going to say, here, it belongs to whoever wants it.
Is there going to be a link to that Photodharma website, or is it you just...
I can distribute that, yeah. Or if you just Google Photodharma, you'll find it. Yeah. So, again, in your hand, well, let me back up and explain one more thing. Classical Buddhism tends to be very technical. I don't know how many of y'all have noticed that, but somebody actually wrote a book, the complete book of Buddhist lists explained. And it just cracked me up when I saw it, because this is an image off the internet, so it's a little fuzzy. But he actually put E equals MC squared at the top of his list of Buddhist lists. That wasn't Siddhartha, that was Albert Einstein. But, he's got a sense of humor about it. But the underlying point is it's extremely technical. Now, I wanted to give you an analogy I could tell you, for instance, if I wanted to be technical, I could tell you force equals mass times acceleration. Newtons equals kilograms times meters per second squared. How much would you get out of that? Really?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. Or I could simply take the book and drop it on the table, and you would see what falls out of the purely technical description. So what I tend to do here is I'm not going into lists and all of this. Okay, here's how this was derived. I don't like derivations. I'm just too old for that, I guess. I don't know. So I tend to focus on a very practical, here's the application of the material. I started to say at the beginning, I wanted to let you know a little bit about me just so that you would understand where the heck I'm coming from, because my approach to this whole business of Buddhism is very different from the approach of many other people. And when I tell it to people, sometimes they're like, what is she saying? I have no idea where this woman is coming from. So I thought I would just recap briefly. I'm 4 days older than dirt. I have one child. I do tend to have a very scientific perspective because my graduate degree is in neurosciences, specifically radiochemistry, chemistry of nuclear. I'm a nuclear scientist originally, so forget that part. I do own my own small business, so I have a perspective in life where I'm not necessarily thinking that I'm as answerable to the world or to authority as the rest of everybody else, because I answer to myself and my clients. Regarding my spiritual background, I was born this way. I didn't have a word for it at the time, but I was forcibly raised Catholic by my family, which were at the time staunch Catholics. And I use the word forcibly in here because there's a lot that's said about the correspondence between Buddhism and Christianity. In fact, Thich Nhat's written a book called, Living Buddha, Living Christ. And of course, in the end, there are similarities in terms of love, compassion, kindness, all this other stuff. But that's where it ends. They really are different. And of course, I've lived a life that has been characterized by conflict over my belief system with everybody I grew up with. So that's why I put that in there. I do tend to be not self-labeling. I didn't even bother to try on the label Buddhism or anything, even in an adjective form, until about a year and a half ago. And I won't explain why I decided, well, I'll try that and see how it works. But my daughter and I attend the Unitarian Universalist Church and have for about 7 years. And that's a type of church where all views are welcome. So you don't have to have a label on you in that kind of an organization. My interests, practical non-sectarianism. I am extremely practical in my outlook, or at least I try to be, and I'm not interested in the ornamentals. I'm only interested in the fundamentals of the belief system. This is, of course, here's an exhibition of attachment, because this is my all-time favorite Buddhist cartoon. This is my dog, my cat, and my ego. And of course, the ego is always the monster in the room. And if you don't realize that now, and if you continue to study this belief system, it's going to jump up and slap you in the face when you realize the extent to which this is actually the case. Even when you think you know how it's the case. It'll surprise you in new and interesting ways. Intersection with science, I actually I like to study quantum physics in my spare time. The Nobel for Physics was just awarded a couple of days ago in the field of quantum optics, I believe. And every time I would go down the rabbit hole of trying to understand quantum mechanics, I'd run up against the brick wall of Buddhism, which is one of the reasons I decided to take a stab at studying it formally. I'm also interested in something called mixing. I'm going to leave that as a teaser. I'm not even going to tell you what it is if you don't know. And of course, my focus in being a very practical, applied person is in being a benefit not to the real attention getters that are out there, but to ordinary mainstream American people. There are some very good organizations out there, Buddhist Global Relief and yada yada. All these, the Prison Dharma network is another one. All very good organizations, but when I sit down and focus on the entire landscape of Western Buddhism, where I see people falling through the cracks is not the the people who are receiving messages called, street Dharma, Dharma punks, or the people overseas, or the people in prisons. It's the ordinary, everyday, mainstream, middle-class American people who I think, are getting the short shrift on this whole thing. So I started a website to help them out. And I field many emails and inquiries from people who find the website and say, well, I'm looking for something and I don't know what, can you help me? So that's my self-appointed role in a geographic area. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, what I'm going to do here is a little different. Your handout actually kind of splits the book in half by number of pages. I've split the presentations by sections because that makes a little more sense to me. So we're going to talk about the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, which is really the guts of Buddhism. And then, of course, there's a bunch of other offshoots from that come in the second sections of the book. Now, somebody, I believe it may have been Thich. I am very good at remembering what was said, and not so good at remembering where I heard it or who said it. But I believe it was Thich said, in order to teach the Dharma, you have to add your own experience. If you simply repeat what you've been told, you're not really teaching the Dharma. So I interpret this quite literally. So we're going to look at the contents of the book, but this being the heart and soul of Buddhism has been done many times by many different authors, and you're going to hear it if you continue to study Buddhism. You'll hear it many different ways with slight twists on each one. So for this reason, it's also particularly appropriate to present these topics from a personal standpoint, because you're going to get it over and over again. You might as well hear it different ways. Our questions have already been distributed. Again, this is a key statement at the top here. We're not looking for people to necessarily spill their guts, but while respecting yourself, the questions for this week are: describe an example of a situation in which you were able to overcome your own suffering, and how were you able to do that? And then the converse is, what haven't you been able to overcome? And these, of course, are not just questions for this class. These are questions for every day of the rest of your life, really. I have a kind of a little bit of an obscure reference up here. I'm a fan of the Dhammapada. In fact, earlier this summer I rewrote it in the context of life in Houston, and I'm publishing that gradually on the website. There are little verses in the Dhammapada that come in pairs in the first section of that scripture, and so I kind of mimic that with my questions because I have a perverse sense of humor. Again, this book goes into more than these first two sections we talked about. It goes into all of the sutras, truths, many different lists, paramitas, but I wanted to focus again on these two key issues, the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, because I think that's the most important section. So in the second week, which will be about a month from now, then the questions will center more on the Eightfold Path. Now, before I get into tackling this actual method of presentation here, some of this may not be new to you guys. I didn't know what stage everybody was at. But I wanted to make the point here. I have a strong bias toward beginners, because people with no knowledge of Buddhism contact me and say, I don't understand this, I don't know where to go, I don't know what to do, I read this book but it doesn't make any sense to me, I don't understand what he's saying, the language seems strange to me. I get all of this stuff from people who are very frustrated. And so I'm particularly sensitive to the distinction between the two types of books that are out there. They can be broadly divided, for the most part, into classically trained monastics, who are usually Asian, and career converts and academics that are Western. And the styles that these two groups have are extremely different. In terms of communication, the Asian monastics tend to be iterative and ongoing. They gave a Dharma talk yesterday. They're going to give another one tomorrow. When you pick up this kind of book in Barnes & Noble, very often, it doesn't say this, but very often the followers of whoever published that book recorded Dharma talks and simply transcribed them without much modification. And of course, presenting material in this format and presenting material in this format coming out of my mouth, that's two different things. And they don't mix very well. So what you end up having is a situation where this is a more iterative assumption. The Asians tend to have absolutely unmatched command of the source wisdom, and that's certainly true of Thich Nhat. I don't know of anyone else on the planet right now who understands the source wisdom better than he does, and he clearly demonstrates it. But the limitation of this axis is that they do tend to have inferior editorial control. I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. The Westerners have a very different mindset. They're usually thinking in terms of a one-shot delivery. English is their mother tongue, so it's very hard to compete with them in terms of clarity. That's just the reality of it. And they do tend to focus on greater editorial control. Again, I wasn't sure. I think Chris is a beginner, and I didn't know if she would be here, but I wanted to point this out because beginners find this type of thing very frustrating. It starts off saying, Buddha was not a god, he was a human being. Well, that's great. It clearly says what Buddha was not. And you'll notice I have viewpoint flags here throughout the presentation. Those are the situations where I'm giving my viewpoint, which is not necessarily the truth. The problem with this approach is that it doesn't really constrain who or what Buddha was. That only comes later. It's not a criticism. It's just an illustration of the types of editorial realities you're going to run up against as you try to get deeper and deeper into this material. This is also, in itself, a good example of the error of judgment, because neither one of these approaches is superior. They both have their strengths and limitations. So one is not good and one is not bad. But it's something to remain mindful of. Obviously, he wasn't just a human being. There's got to be more of an explanation than that. We often hear this phrase or this adjective, he was an awake human being. How many of you know that kind of statement sounds really insightful and it sounds good at first measure. But how many of you know people who really seem to be extremely perceptive, but they're not the least bit awake? That happens to me a lot. So that word is overused in American Buddhism in particular, this awake concept. The explanation I personally find to be closest to the mark is John Bush's. He describes the Buddha as a new paradigm of humanity. And I don't know if anyone's seen that film series, but it's a great film series. Thich Nhat goes on to say a few pages later that he is a free person. Okay. And you think to yourself, if you're a beginner, now we're getting somewhere. We've sort of constrained it. And he further explains that the Buddha was a person free of suffering. And this is where the Four Noble Truths enter into the equation, because they are all about suffering. And what I've done here, and you can see that I have a fondness for cartoons, is I've put Thich Nhat's description, his personal way of expressing the Four Noble Truths is rather complex, and it's very causal. Different people express this in different ways. But in all cases, you have two things in common. One is this idea of, well, somebody's not well, there's a diagnosis, there's a cure. This is, in just about everybody's presentation, the same thing echoed. I really like this one. Doctor, I don't feel well and I'm not sure why. And the doctor says, I want you to meditate for 20 minutes twice a day, exercise for at least 30 minutes a day, avoid processed foods, eat plenty of organic fruit and vegetables, spend more time in nature and less indoors. Stop worrying about things you can't control, ditch your TV, come back in 3 weeks. So that pretty much encapsulates a great deal of the path right there in that one little cartoon. Here's a quick and dirty version. And this is kind of, I tend to be very cut and dried, and so I like this one. Suffering exists. It has an origin or a cause. It can stop. And there's a path out of suffering. There it is. Active voice, many fewer words, less sophisticated, but easier to remember. So to understand the Four Noble Truths, I am going to circle around back to the book in just a minute. But I wanted to give a personal example because everything is all about this idea of suffering. And we can't stress enough what suffering is. If you want to overcome something, you first have to understand exactly what the heck you're dealing with. So I came up with an example which just happened to have transpired as I was parsing this book. I read a lot, so I actually read this one back in July. And people will tell you this when you read their particular books or whatever. You have to understand that suffering is a subjective experience. And by that, what they mean is it's a judgment. It's not an actual fact that applies equally to everyone, and I'll show you why. We have some ideas in the West that are equivalent to this. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. One man's meat is another man's poison. Same idea, right? Okay, so here's me, July of 2012. This is my home. Here's my book. The question is, if you had to spend 10 nights with that as your entire home, would you suffer? There was heat. There was rain. There were ants. I could spend an hour just telling you about the ants. I spent a lot of time meditating on the subject of ants. There were mosquitoes. There's always mosquitoes. There was a rogue koi wolf. I'm going to explain this in just a minute. And there was one extremely large mountain lion. Circumstances were such that I was camping by myself. I do not recommend that people do that, but I was chaperoning my 14-year-old, and God knows you cannot leave a 14-year-old girl to her own recognizance. So I ended up sort of without good alternatives in this situation. I wanted to give her some space, but I needed to be there to put an end to what shouldn't be happening. So I ended up camping on some family land, but it's a great tract of land and it's way in the middle of absolute nowhere. No bathroom. Even Shakyamuni's monks had a latrine. So these were, of course, very Spartan conditions. Now I wanted to explain about these two things in particular, because they lead into the example I'm going to give about suffering and mindfulness. This particular area is up in Canada, and there are a large number of large carnivores. We call them koi wolves because the coyotes there interbred with the wolves. So instead of having this cute little yellow thing like we have here in Texas, in terms of a coyote, they're big buggers. And they're much more aggressive. And they have, in this area, they have killed one woman and they have attacked other humans and tried to kill them. Mountain lion, it just astonished me how large that was. What happened was I was fishing around, I was on my knees fishing in my tent looking for my breakfast, which is a granola bar. And I heard crows, a whole symphony of crows. And it cracks me up because the Dhammapada is extremely judgmental about crows. I don't know if you've read it, but they have no good things to say about crows. They're nasty and they're backbiting. Well, crows hate lions because they're predators. And so I heard crows just screaming behind me, and I was like, what's going on? I pulled back up to the tent, and there's a lion standing behind me. Now, there's a story somewhere about the Buddha in a previous life offering himself to be eaten by a lion so that the lion's cubs may survive. I'm not there. I don't really want to be eaten by a lion. Anyway, to make a long story short, what this situation boiled down to was a situation in which I needed to figure out what was going on. I had a choice at that point. I could have just freaked out and said, holy crap, there's the biggest lion I've ever seen. And not only that, I know there's coyotes because I can hear them. Big coyotes, nasty coyotes. I could have just left. But every situation like this where you feel yourself, okay, it's time to run away now, that's an opportunity to learn. So what I did was I trotted down half a mile to one of my family's homes and cousins' homes and said, can I borrow a rake? And every night, this was a sandy area, I would go around the entire perimeter. This would take me like 30 minutes. And I would rake the sand because I needed to see what was coming at me. And if I just left it all a mess, I wouldn't be able to track these animals because I needed to answer the obvious question. Are these things trying to eat me? Or do I just happen to be on the Autobahn for animals here and they're just passing through? They do kill people, but not very often. So it's a valid question. So here you see, this is what I would see every morning for 10 mornings. These huge canine tracks, and there's my foot for scale. So this stride length, his legs are about the same length as mine. And he's coming right at the tent every night. And then one morning, when I started looking for more than tracks, I found a body impression in the sand next to the tent. And here's my point in explaining all this in detail. When in life you are faced with an enormous challenge and you feel threatened, it doesn't matter whether it's a practical challenge like camping or an emotional challenge like in your family or your marriage or your job or whatever, if you really pull back and try to apply mindfulness, a very odd thing happens. You will often see an echo of your own mindfulness somehow reflected in the physical world. And in this case, what it was the raking. The external situation, the activity, was mimicking what was going on inside of the head. And if you stop and pull back and vacate your judgment, you're going to see this thing happen, and it's really, really weird when you come upon it. What happens if you don't break your own sand? You end up in delusion. I've been able to read for 43 years now. And I've been going to this family land for 43 years. It wasn't until July of 2012 that I realized we're right down the road from delusion. There is actually a place called delusion there. And for 43 years, I never noticed. But because all of this other stuff was going on and I was trying real hard, I realized, holy cow, this is really weird. The monkey mind expressed in sand. Everything is a mess. If you don't break your sand, most of what you see here is just going to mask what the reality is in this moment. Remember, there's a whole bunch of tracks here. They look different sizes and different shapes. That all happened in the past. That doesn't have anything to do with the moments that I was going through. This is what happens. This is a symbolic representation of what's in your head. If you don't practice mindfulness and meditation according to some labeling system, it could be Buddhist or, hey, for decades I called it common sense. When you engage in mindful raking, the dust settles, literally, and all of a sudden you start to see what's really there. And in this case, on a practical level, there was a rabbit. You see his little bunny tail and his long back feet and his little short paws. Here we have a coyote, the bigger tracks, and also a fox. This was, in fact, a runway for animals. They make specific paths through the woods. Raccoon, and then there was stuff there that I couldn't identify, but I know they were something distinct. So, that was an example of how I was in a situation where I simply could have succumbed to the element of suffering, fear, and aversion, or I could have pulled back and said, okay, what's really going on here? I chose the latter path, and I'm very glad I did, because I experienced no suffering, except for the ants. But anyway, there is resistance to this idea. Suffering is not entirely subjective. Some things would cause anyone to suffer. That sounds good on the surface, but it's actually not true. There's a semantic note here. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. And again, this is a viewpoint advisory. I've observed some teachers of Buddhism screwing this up, frankly, and obscurating the differences between pain and suffering. We all feel pain. We don't necessarily need to suffer. Suffering arises out of a resistance, not accepting things the way things are. It is a derivative. It's not a baseline condition. Consider that even death itself does not appear to bring suffering to certain people. As Sandra noted in her presentation, a whole lot of Dharma expresses itself at Houston area convenience stores. This was a tragic case. When if you're reading the Chronicle and you come upon these stories and you come upon one of these in your day, you just got to stop and put your head on the desk and take a moment, because this extraordinary young man was shot trying to help, it was about a year and a half ago, he was shot trying to help a woman who was being victimized by a criminal. If you read the accounts, he had that characteristic. He always tried to help. He was never, by accounts, in his own ego. He was always helping others. So this guy, from what we can tell, he simply went through his life and went through his death and never had any of this fear or aversion. Oh, I better run away, there's a guy living on, this whole thing did not characterize him. So we see examples like this pretty frequently, actually. Now, that was kind of a sobering example. Here's a more lighthearted example. Yes, I was a little younger there, but you can see that I have a 6-foot snake wrapped around my neck. And I put this in here because there's been several references in this class so far to the idea of if you see something on the path and you don't know if it's a snake or a rope, you may be afraid, you may have fear and aversion until you discover it's just a harmless rope. Well, I'd actually prefer to find a snake in the path of life, because I know snakes and I know how to handle them, and I know when they are harmful or when they're not harmful. And so this doesn't cause me any stress or fear or aversion. I know when to stay away, when it's time to stay away. And they're actually very nice animals if you get to know them. They're very cuddly because they're cold-blooded. My one advisory, of course, is never wrap a snake around your neck unless you know it's not a constrictor, because that's just not a good thing to do. But anyway, that's a more lighthearted example of something. This would cause suffering for a great number of people, a huge fraction of our society. And for me, it causes delight. All right, so that is my particular spin on the issue of suffering. Now let's take a look at the Eightfold Path. I forgot to set my timer, so I don't know where we are. Thich Nhat presents a non-hierarchical view, and this is a little faint, but I actually find this to be extremely beneficial the way he sketched this out. If you look at this, page 57, he's got arrows drawn connecting all of these things. And this is somewhat of a different presentation than many other authors use. Many people are just going to slap down a graphic of some kind and show the Dharma chakra, Dharma wheel type of presentation without any interrelationship. By the way, that is what I'm wearing around my neck for those of you who don't. Pretty much everyone in this room knows what this symbol means. This web of connecting lines signifies the fact that you can't have any one of these things in isolation. Just as you can't have a table in isolation or a human being in isolation, you also cannot have an explanation of how this stuff all fits together in isolation. It simply doesn't work that way. Other presentations, these are from a couple of other authors, again with the technical focus, and particularly when you take the technical focus and you coalesce that with an American mindset, they try to break it into some kind of a hierarchy, meditation, wisdom, morality, and then they group various aspects under there. That can be helpful to you as you're, considering from various angles what this stuff means to you. Wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental development is another type of way of looking at it. Although myself, I kind of default back to what Thich Nhat does here, simply because he does stress this interconnection. What I'm going to do now is get off of my own personal Dharma spiel, and I'm going to run through each of the 8 chapters, just summarizing. It's a lot of material. I can't really do it justice in the time available, but I'm going to tell you the highlights as I see them from each of these chapters, adding in a little bit of caveat here and there. He starts with right view, which he describes as a deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And here is when he introduces the idea of the seeds, wholesome seeds versus unwholesome seeds, and watering the seeds through wholesome living. You've probably heard the expression before that if you really want to teach something, the best way to teach it is to live it and to set your example so that other people can see. That's a lot more effective than standing up and saying, you gotta do this, and this is the wise thing to do. You manifest the reality behind it. In this chapter, he also introduces some of the more advanced constructs that are a little difficult for me and beginners. Suchness and no view is right view. Again, there's various steps on this path, steps of sophistication in the learning system, and so he kind of makes a little stack of into the more advanced areas here. He stresses that right view is both a cause and effect of the other elements on the path. You sort of have to begin with a little right view, but what happens is as you're starting to entrain the other elements, right speech, right diligence, your view, there's a feedback effect. Your view gets strengthened that way. Chapter 10, right thinking, derives largely from right view. But again, always remember the feedback effect. There are 4 practical practices that he lists out for right view. And he uses, this is another one of Thich and Hanh's strengths as in my viewpoint as I see them compared to other authors. He pulls in some really practical methods of cognitive reframing on a lot of this stuff. One of them is the question, are you sure? Except that appears to be an editorial imperfection, because I think what he means is, am I sure? Meaning, you ask yourself that. When I first read this section of the book, I was like, are you sure? What am I doing? Are you sure? What am I doing? And it confused the heck out of me. But I think he means you're supposed to be looking in a mirror when you ask that question, because it all comes back to individuals and individual perceptions. I'm reminded of when I read this of the Lojong slogans, which are the Mahayana slogans, and there's 59 of them, and one of them is drive all blames into one. And that's kind of what this is referencing. When you need to know what's right and what's wrong, there's one place to look, and that's inside of yourself. What am I doing? It's a mechanism to return to the present moment. There's a non-sectarian Canadian meditation proponent. His name is Eckhart Tolle. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name properly, but this is a little key. This is a little thing you can do to snap yourself to where you need to be. And Eckhart Tolle has an analog, and what he suggests when you're meditating is to ask yourself, what's your next thought? And what I do is, that's too verbose. If you sit there and ask yourself, it's a great concentration mechanism. What's my next thought? And you don't ask it verbally, of course, it's in your head. It really helps to quiet your mind down because it's recursive, like this. And so what I do is, I don't want to be verbal, so I will sometimes visualize a space that if I was visualizing a construct, it would have a question mark in it, if that makes any sense to you. But this is a very similar idea right here. Hello, habit energy. And I believe it was John who said to be very, it was in a previous meeting, and we were talking about anger, and I forget exactly the context. But the idea put forth was, you gotta stand outside of yourself and look at what you're doing. If you're angry, say, Mr. Anger. Yeah. It was a comment like that, and I was like, okay, that's it. That's right on the money. When I started vegetable gardening, I didn't do it because I had paranoid fear that I was going to get poisoned by eating the food in Kroger. I did it because I was trying to force myself into a particular habit energy because I know just how strong they are. So, in other words, I was trying to set myself up kind of through a channeling. I want to say self-coercion, and some days that's a better description. But really it's an energy channeling. So he recommends that you be very, very aware of just how much your habits dictate the course of your life. And when you start to see it, of course, it's horrifying. And then the last idea, he doesn't go into much detail, but think in terms of love. Now, what I've always used since the age of 3 oh well, the first one since the age of 3. That's when I first realized that I had this mindset. I was 3 years old, and I was told that I had to defer to the authority of a hierarchy, which did not at all seem connected to me, to my life or real life. But anyway, I formulated the question, what's really going on here? What's really going on here? And I found that to be extremely useful throughout my life. Not judgmentally, what's really going on here, but just vacate your ideas and step back and look. I'm not an expert at it by any means, but I find it very useful. Now, there's an American author, a medical doctor named Rudolf Dreikurs, and if you've ever had children, you may have heard of this book, Children the Challenge. It was published in a very good year, 1964. And what he recommends is very similar. You step back and you say, what are the needs of the situation? And I really like this expression of the perspective because it defers to the fact that this is an integrated whole. What are the needs of this situation? Well, I keep talking and not run over 1 hour. Instead of looking at it from the standpoint of, what do I want? What does she want? What does he want? What does the government want? Whatever. You have to look at the whole thing and say, okay, what are the needs of the situation? And it sounds a little Mickey Mouse, and in certain situations, if you apply that, it will sound a little bit wonky. Like, this couldn't possibly work. And I can't tell you how many times in my life I've sat down and said, okay, let me respond solely to the needs of the situation, and we'll see what happens. And everything works out. Just like magic. And I was like, oh, I wouldn't have foreseen that. Anyway, again, these are restatements of these very same ideas. Chapter 11. This one is a huge pill to swallow. This one is the one where he goes into the list-a-thon, and it's simply overwhelming. But he talks about mindfulness as the energy that brings us back to the present moment. And this is one of my favorite, again, that's an attachment statement, but I'm having to simplify. This is one of my favorite statements of the book. If you do not live deeply this moment, it will only be a dream. So if you're going to take anything against the avalanche of material, from the avalanche of material in Chapter 11, that's probably a good one to hold on to. Again, he goes into the miracles of mindfulness, the establishments of mindfulness. This is something I don't understand about this book. He dances around. There's a very elegant connection between the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, and the practice of meditation. They dovetail precisely. And so in this chapter, I don't know why he does it this way exactly. I don't understand it. But he talks about the two main components of meditation, but not in the context of meditation. And I kind of look at that as, I'm not really sure if that's a wise thing to do or a missed opportunity. Because he invokes them but doesn't explain how it all comes into one seamless whole.
This is just my own personal thing, but I had a real trouble differentiating between the right concentration and the right mindfulness.
It's kind of why that's a very good point, because it sounds like those are, we'll get to that.
Okay.
About the concentration and insight.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually the three parts together. That is morality, concentration, and insight. When he talk about the Four Noble Truths and Noble Eightfold Path, Noble Eightfold Path, some kind of one of them is the right action. That is preset morality, and from the morality it will develop the concentration. Just like an example of like the oil lamp. We have the lamp shape, so that keeps the light stand still, so the wind cannot disturb the light inside. So when the light stands still, the fire stands still, then the light, then we can have the light. So the lamp, the lamp shade is present for morality, and the 5 is present, stand still 5 is present concentration, and the light is wisdom. So how is the 3 things go together?
It's a good point. Yeah, there's a slide coming up that was going to kind of drag, he starts to drag the precepts into all of this as well, and I'll get to that in just a second. Here's an exercise that I have found to be useful, and that I recommend. Regarding this idea about living in the moment, and you're going to hear this again, this whole now thing expressed all over the place in many different ways. What I try to do to people is to encourage them, when you've noticed that your mind has wandered, try to remember what happened around you in that moment when you were daydreaming or projecting what you thought was going to happen. See what you can remember from that interval. Do you have any memories at all? Invariably, this answer is going to come back no, and you're going to realize the extent to which you were not there. And sometimes I'll say this to people, and they'll say something like, well, I was just sitting in a chair waiting for the bus. Nothing important happened. I didn't miss anything. And I say, well, but if you don't know what happened, how can you draw that conclusion? It's illogical, as argued. So that's how I tie my own viewpoint into this particular set of ideas here. He also makes the point that you have to be mindful all day in all of your activities, not just for the amount of time you spend on the cushion. Right speech. Now, here's where I start having major problems, which is one of the reasons why I structured the questions as I did. The classical interpretation, as I understand it, is very simple on what constitutes right speech. Be truthful, be consistent, be kind, be accurate. There isn't much of an expound in some of the lineages or lines of thought. He does make the observation that it's based on right thinking and that it's founded on deep, compassionate listening. And again, there's several definitions here we got to be careful of semantically. Compassion in the sense of Buddhism. In America, we seem to have this idea that compassion is almost something akin to pity, but pity is actually what Ayakima, she was a Theravada nun, she calls it the near enemy of love. We tend to think that if we drop what we're doing and we put ourselves out for someone because they're having difficulty, that's compassion. But as I understand it in the Buddhist sense of it, compassion means first and foremost understanding. You have to understand what's happening to someone else, and then things proceed from there. He also gives some very good asynchronous approaches in this book, meaning that if you think you're going to engage in something that's not right speech, you're tired, you're not feeling well, whatever, he does recommend you step back and say, okay, we need to have this conversation later because I can't do it justice right now. Increasingly in our society, with our smartphones and Facebook and all the rest of it, we're moving more and more to asynchronous communication, which does have its advantages, actually. And this is one of them, and that is that you can modulate yourself the way you might not always be able to in real time. Again, the precepts start entering here. His interpretation, as expressed in the 4th precept, is more elaborate. And I have this huge viewpoint flag on this one because I see an issue with that. And I don't know that we have the time or the desire to go into this, but here's something I would recommend to you. It is a fundamental law of humanity that you can tell people what to do or you can tell people how to do something, but you cannot tell them both, because you will cause a fundamental karmic interference with their humanity if you try to do that. Do not take my word for it. Try it yourself. And this is the issue that I have with some of what he expresses, because he's divorcing it from context, and Buddhism is all about context and intent. And I'm not sure why that happens. If it's just a tool he's using for beginners who need that to get to the next step, that may very well be the case. But I see this resonates with me. because it leaves the context and the intent to the discretion of the experiencer, which is appropriate. The minute you start dictating, do this in this situation, do that in that situation, you've removed that whole process. And so I won't say anything more about that right now, but that'd be a good thread discussion maybe for us in our off-class group.
Could you give you give like just an example, like a daily life simple example?
I sure
of
can,
doing that?
yeah. In his precepts, he says, for example, wrong speech is speech that could break the family. Well, there's a lot of quote-unquote families out there that need to be broken because they're abusive in their present forms. And you can't fix that. You can't make a positive contribution without breaking the family. My family is one of a type like that. And if I spoke in terms of preserving the family, I would be preserving alcoholism and drug abuse and all the rest, right? So that's just foolish. That doesn't parse. So, but again, it's intent. If I speak in a way that is intended to relieve suffering by helping children to avoid the same pitfalls, that's where I get into a lot of trouble. I want to show them that there is an alternative lifestyle to some of what I have in my family. So I will go in there and start tearing things apart because there's no other way. So there's an assumption that every family deserves to be kept together. So you can't say anything that would, or by family I'm meaning like the rhetoric, whatever, however you want to define it. And it's not appropriate. It's simply not appropriate. And a lot of the way he's done the precepts to me are direct contradictions to each other. So anyway, but again, that's a whole other subject, and it will be a good off-class discussion. Right action. There's a focus here on the body. Now again, I had a conniption fit when I first read this because he talks about the mindfulness trainings, and I didn't realize for the longest time that they were synonymous with the precepts. So again, if you're a beginner and if you're trying to dive into this, and I try to see things, this to me is compassion. I see things through the eyes of the beginner. I'm trying to see what a beginner sees. This was confusing to me. Precepts 1, 2, 3, and 5 are reflected through action. 4 is speech. Whoops. Again, you see the interrelation. Right action has to originate from right view and right thinking, and it has to be put out there, expressed through right speech. And it is linked to right livelihood, which is another one of my favorite things to talk about. Diligence is the energy that helps realize the Noble Eightfold Path. I'll give you a spoiler on my second week set of questions, where I said, what's one aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path that you feel you understand well? I'm an immigrant. I'm used to approaching the world in a certain way and working in a certain way, and the whole idea of effort or diligence is something that I feel I know a little better than some of these other things because I've had to do it for 25 years now. Again, we see the characteristic paired symmetry that so often defines Buddhism arising. The 4 practices preventing unwholesome seeds from arising and helping them to cease, encouraging the wholesome seeds to arise, and then helping wholesome seeds to continue. Habit energy is very much reflected in these ideas here. Sometimes the effort precedes the realization. He made the point in the book that sometimes adults have to practice meditative methods for 4 or 5 years before they really start to get it. And that's very much what I've, observed in life about anything. It makes sense to you intellectually, but you may not feel it deeply until you're into it for a while, and all of a sudden it's part of you. So that's something that's very familiar to me. In our university systems, especially for a technical career like I've had, a lot of the way that we bring younger members up through the ranks is to make them act like what they're eventually going to become. And in fact, that's one of the strengths of Vajrayana Buddhism. you act like a Buddha until you are a Buddha. It's the same idea, except it's not a university program, it's a spiritual program. But at the same time, it should be joyful. If you are telling yourself, this stuff makes sense, I'm going to go with it and see where it leads me, but you're getting a feeling in your gut that it's not right, then you need to step back and say, okay, maybe something's not what I think it is here. Right concentration. Cultivate a mind that is one-pointed. Again, we're circling the wagons. We're going around this idea of how meditation factors into these teachings. I reversed his presentation because when our Western brains think of this, we start small and we build from there. Selective concentration is where you focus on one thing. In meditation, that's important because unless you can quiet your mind down long enough, you can't expand from there because you're just going to have too much turbulence. So unless you can get the selective down pat, there's only so far you can go with the active, which is more like the insight type of meditation. He does go into some lists here, including the meditative absorptions, which I must say are a complete black box to me at this point in my life. And he does mention various other concentration practices besides the classic simple one-pointedness. Right livelihood. Also one of my favorite cartoons. So, what do you do? I'm a cashier. I didn't mean what do you do with your money, I mean what do you do for the world? The sutras define right livelihood as earning a living without transgressing any of the precepts. We've heard that before. In the classical interpretation, no weapons, no slave trade, no meat trade, no intoxications, poisons, or fortune-telling type of activities. The most important point that I feel he makes in this chapter for us is that what you do has an impact on collective consciousness. I will add that right livelihood is not that, it isn't this paycheck. It's not just what draws a paycheck. It's how we serve our community, because in America we're wealthy enough to do both. In fact, that's one of the reasons we're all here today. I'm going to give you an example of where these two ideas converge, and my example is my own website and my counterpart, who's called Michigan Buddhist. He's up in Michigan, obviously. And he's running a website where he's trying to do exactly what I'm trying to do, which is to forget all of the deep, meaningful, personal reflections and just focus on, okay, how do I determine what people need, and then how do I fill that need? So he runs a site up there, and he is a monastic, I believe. I forget his name, but he's a Zen guy. And he's constantly pulling all of the information from all over Michigan into one place so that when people are looking for Buddhist resources in Michigan, they're not overwhelmed by Google searches and able to make no sense of it. They find it at his website. Now, what happened to him a couple months ago is that the Chinese government took down his site. And you say to yourself, what just happened there? I don't know how many of you search the web, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds of American Buddhist blog sites out there. But 95% of them are of the personal reflection variety where people are just throwing up, okay, here's what happened to me when I sat on the cushion today. And then they have these personal anecdotes. And some of them are revealing, but mostly what they do, in my view, is they clog up the internet for people who are really looking like, okay, what's happening at this temple? Should I go and visit them? What books should I be reading? Michigan Buddhist was the standout. He was the guy who was actually doing the practical connectivity. And the Chinese government knew that, and they took him down because he was changing the collective consciousness. All of the other Buddhist sites, they were just using information. Now, there may have been others that were taken down. I don't know. But his story I do know because I contacted him. Because as soon as I saw that he'd been hacked, I was like, oh gosh, because I might be next. Every morning I log on, see that my website is still there, and I'm like, oh cool, I'm still up. what you do has an impact on collective consciousness. Anything that strengthens Western Buddhism, Buddhism in America, will directly or indirectly improve Tibet's cause. And the Chinese government does not want that. So that's just one example of how this one guy is sitting up there in Michigan, and the Chinese government is smart enough to know that he is in a position to change the collective consciousness. And they don't necessarily want that. At least that's what we think. Now, we have no direct evidence of why they took him down, but he does know from his forensics that it was the Chinese. And he didn't even endorse. I'm very careful not to mention His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, anywhere on my website, because I don't want it to be searchable that way. I don't want to be a target. I don't have a lot of technical skills. Anyway, that's my example of, you may think that you're doing one little thing, but you don't know what it might possibly lead to. It's very important. It's very important that we all decide. Now, those of us with families and jobs and everything, we only have a little amount of time to devote to this kind of thing, but it's very, very important to do it. Okay? Yay! This concludes week 1. I'm not quite sure where you were during